The 46th Antoinette Brown Lecture is made possible by a gift from Sylvia Sanders Kelly of Atlanta, Georgia. The lectures began in 1974 and are intended to bring to the school distinguished women theologians to speak on concerns for women in ministry. The lectureship is named for Antoinette Brown, the first woman ordained to the Christian ministry in the United States. Antoinette Louisa Brown Blackwell was born in Henrietta, New York on May 20, 1825, and began to speak publicly in the services of the local Congregational Church at age 9. She was graduated from Oberlin College in 1847 and completed its Theological Seminary in 1850, though she was not granted her degree. Oberlin later conferred on her an honorary Master of Arts in 1878 and a Doctor of Divinity in 1908. Refused ordination at first because of her sex, she held a Congregationalist pastorate in South Butler, New York for 4 years. She became the first ordained woman minister in the United States on her ordination on September 15, 1853, but was dismissed in July 1854, evidently by her own wish. She later became a Unitarian. In 1856, she married Samuel C. Blackwell, whose brother, Henry B. Blackwell, had married her Oberlin College friend, Lucy Stone. The family settled in New Jersey. Mrs. Blackwell preached frequently in Unitarian and other liberal pulpits. Active as a speaker and writer for women's rights, temperance, abolition of slavery, and other causes, she preached her last sermon when she was 90 years old, and her last book appeared when she was 93. She died in Elizabeth, New Jersey on November 5th, 1921, at the age of 96. Celebrating the Oberlin roots of the Divinity School, we are pleased to offer this lectureship in Antoinette Brown's honor. This year's Brown Lecturer is the Reverend Dr. Loida I. Martell, who is the 18th Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean and Professor of Constructive Theology at Lexington Theological Seminary. Martell joined the faculty of Lexington Theological Seminary in August of 2017. Prior to that, she was the professor of constructive theology at Palmer Theological Seminary of Eastern University in Pennsylvania. Martell is a licensed doctor in veterinary medicine, as well as an ordained minister in the American Baptist Churches, USA. She is a bicoastal Puerto Rican who has taught in various institutions of higher learning. She pastored in New York City for 15 years and served as president of the Board of American Baptist Churches, New York City, from 1994 to 1996. Martell pioneered the study of Evangelica theology. She has published articles on various topics related to Evangelica theology, including, quote, "My GPS doesn't work in Puerto Rico." She co-edited Theologia in Conjunto, a collaborative Hispanic Protestant theology, and co-authored Latina Evangelicas, a theological survey from the margins. She has contributed blogs and podcasts on the Hispanic Theological Initiative's Open Plaza, including, quote, "I Am Not Your Virus, COVID-19 and Climate Change." She is a member of the American Veterinary Veterinary Medical Association, the Kentucky Veterinary Medical Association, the American Academy of Religion, and the Society for Biblical Literature. And I don't think anybody else in any of those organizations can claim membership in all four. Dr. Martell served as president of La Comunidad of Hispanic Scholars of Religion from 2016 to 2019. She represents the ABC USA on the National Councils of Churches convening table for theological studies in matters of faith and reason, and on the NCC Racial Advisory Committee. The American Baptist Home Mission Societies awarded her the 2015 Richard Hoyland Christian Education Award, its highest recognition for faithful and effective leadership in Christian education, for her long-standing work in nurturing culturally and racially diverse classrooms, and for exceptional leadership. The title of her lecture is, quote, "The God Who Is," close quote. Following the lecture, Dean Martell will entertain questions, and then we will retire to the atrium for reception. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Martell to Vanderbilt Divinity School and the larger university.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the God alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Good evening, Dean Dr. Emily Towns, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Dr. Ellen Armour, esteemed faculty, staff, students, and invited guests here, present, and those live streaming. I am grateful to be in this honored space with you today and this evening during this time that recognizes a pioneer among women called to ministry, the Reverend Antoinette Brown. It is a privilege to be in a space occupied particularly by those who preceded me on this podium, some who are no longer with us, but are part of the cloud of witnesses leaving evidence of their prophetic ministries through their vocation in the church and the academy to serve a suffering world that daily cries for salvation and life. They, like so many of you, responded to a call from God on the firm belief captured in the words of the Deuteronomist, "The Lord is your God." An affirmation of love that is expressed not in privatistic, pious musings that only satisfy the ego, but a love that is embodied in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, the one who lived in the peripheric spaces with the poor and despised of the world, and according to Hebrews 13:12, who died in those spaces outside the gate of hope and justice. We are preceded by people who loved God and loved the world, and because they loved God and loved the world, stood outside the gates where the Christ of this God beckoned them and beckons us today. I stand before you with deep humility because I believe that the reason we are in these academic spaces and what are often the centers of power and knowledge is because we love God with all our hearts and have sensed that beckoning. As Abraham Heschel so movingly claims, we have heard the silent cries of the suffering and felt God's heart for those who agonize in the world. Else, why are we here? And why now? I mean, Why not in business school or law school or medical school? I mean, we'd be making money. But you see, we are, like Jeremiah, touched by a fire within that allows us aught but to respond to God. In short, we are a people called to serve God, called to be in what the Jewish tradition refers to as tikkun olam, a creative and prophetic relationship to heal that which is broken. I too heeded that call. I am a bicoastal Puerto Rican born in New York City, raised on the island of Puerto Rico. I am an evangelica, a pluriform Protestant whose roots are rich with indigenous and African spiritualities, Catholic popular faith, and the inheritance of Protestant missionaries. I was a practicing veterinarian who came in from the fields to return to the urban centers of the U.S. in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And I have discovered throughout my journey that I have been called at different times in different ways for different reasons, but always coram Deo, standing before the God who is, and quietly saying, "The Lord is my God, and therefore here I am." When I was called to pastor in the Bronx in 1990, the world was facing a global pandemic. The human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, was devastating communities throughout the world. Misinformation and the politicization of a medical emergency created a situation in which far too many people died without treatment for far too long. Rather than being comforted, those taken ill were shamefully silenced and made invisible. And during that period, wars by proxy were raging in Nicaragua and El Salvador, creating a sea of refugees that no one wanted, and those who fueled these wars refused to take responsibility. So here we are today. Again, we face a worldwide pandemic. We find again ourselves dealing with a disease that has been politicized, overrun with misinformation, and with a misplaced hate towards people other during this time of pandemic. Consequently, excessive deaths, that's what they're calling it, excessive deaths have surged throughout our country and the world. We walk in a fog to which the therapist, Dr. Yvonne Martinez-Thorne, refers to as a complicated grief, a grief in grief through grief. It almost seems that death has permeated the very pores of the earth and the air that we breathe. Since the arrival of the subacute respiratory coronavirus 2, otherwise known as COVID-19, in December of 2019, almost 80 million have been infected in the U.S., and close to 1 million have died. Worldwide, almost 500 million persons are infected, and over 6 million have died as of April 2022. What has complicated our sense of grief and loss is the very real confrontation with what pundits have called the other pandemic, but which many of us who have ministered among communities of color know as more akin to being an endemic, an evil that is present or usually prevalent in the population at all times. The deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery are only multiplied grief upon grief, with those of Antonio Baez, Amadou Diallo, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Adam Toledo, and so many others who have not even made the headlines and who have also lost their lives to the overzealousness of law enforcement. We are suffering the violence of white supremacy that once again has become mainstream, suffering through the unjust deaths of African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx, migrants, Native Americans, Muslims, and trans and non-binary people, and countless others who have somehow been determined to be sobrajas, leftovers, a people easily discarded, thrown aside, ignored, removed like so much refuse, stuck to the bottom of someone's shoes. As we are now gathered in these hallowed halls of learning, we are newly confronted by war. The macho posturing and authoritarianism of a few who believe themselves to be gods have led to the invasion of Ukraine and the harbinger of nuclear holocaust. Millions of people are again migrating as they face the specter of unprecedented death, joined by the millions already displaced by ecological disasters. How ironic and how tragic that the deep divisions of hate, distrust, and socio-political enmities that rent us apart have now conjoined in a war of such potential for such utter destruction. Among all these crises of violence and death, of loss and displacement, the very planet is heaving in death rattles. Climate scientists who have long been warning of the dangers of global warming are in despair as year after year we choose death over life. It is now expected that if we do not reverse carbon emissions and slow warming by the year 2030, climate change will be irreversible and catastrophic. It is our way of life that imperils the life of the earth. How can we claim to be tikkun olam if we are the viruses? We are the viruses infecting the air, the waterways, and the land with the toxins that we produce uncaringly, bringing death and destruction to the created world. And so here we are, called to serve in such a world by the God who is. And that is precisely the prophetic power of our callings, that in the face of utter loss and utter desolation, we can say that we believe in and serve the Lord who is. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is. So this evening, I want to focus on the isness of the God who calls us. Specifically, I want to focus on the God of Vida, of life and love, the one who brings life, hope, and justice amid so much death in a world where love has grown cold. I will then talk about the God who is Verbo, word, and verdad, truth, the one who reminds us not to fling our words to the ground and to discern the illegible fragments of truth that permit us to hear the voices of the silent ones. And finally, I want to talk about the God who is Presencia, presence, and Presente, present, in the peripheric spaces to bring hope, healing, and transformation. And I will conclude with a call, because I'm Baptist. So we always conclude with a call. So I will conclude with a call and a challenge. You can never give a Baptist a microphone. I will conclude with a call and a challenge that we are to follow the God of isness by becoming other being people, other being people, ones whose motivations are not influenced by the me virus of consumerism and self-ambition, but rather who seek to be straight-necked people who serve as conduits of the God of Vida, Verbo, and Presencia. And if nothing else, you'll speak in tongues by the end of this. So let me begin with the God who is Vida, life and love. Scripture reveals that God is the source of all love, of all life. Early church tradition affirmed this. God is creator and life giver. God is life. In 1 John 4:8, it states that this God who is life giver is love. God is love. As such, God is also the God of justice and mercy and faithfulness. These are not different attributes that God has or a description of what God does, but rather are assertions about God's isness. God who is life wills life and created life to be in loving relations with God and with each other and with the created world, including the earth. Life and love are integral to the biblical understanding of justice, and justice is predicated on an ethos of relationality. Thus, justice is not based simply on acts or behaviors, but it as an ethos, an isness of life. It is why the biblical Hebrew and Greek terms associated with justice, tzedakah, mishpah, dekaizunie, are often translated as righteousness in English. It's interesting because in Spanish, we don't have that word righteousness. Spanish, it's translated as justicia, as justice. This is why Spanish is the language of heavens, but that's a whole other presentation. It's translated as righteousness in English Bibles to indicate right-wise or righting of relationships. Justice is based on right relationships, first and foremost with God. And yet a right relationship with God demands that there is a right relationship with a larger community, not only with humans, but with all of creation. All of creation is interrelated. In the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, is interbeing. And as Karen Baker Fletcher reminds us, no one aspect of creation is superior to any other. Unlike the secular notion of justice that demands an unbiased stance to be fair, the biblical notion is intentionally biased. It is particularly concerned about the welfare and treatment of the most vulnerable in society, the poor, the stranger, that is to say the ger or the resident alien, the widow, the orphan, and those whom the Second Testament later identifies as the least of these. So while justice and life are intertwined, injustice kills. One cannot be unjust and claim to follow the God who is life and justice. Today, we live in a world filled with injustice. Injustice that is hidden behind pious words of false religiosity and sanctimonious punditry. Indeed, we live in a globalized world. Globalization is a complex ideology that has seeped into and influenced our socioeconomic, political, religious institutions, among others. Its foundational raison d'être, I practiced that about 5 times so that it wouldn't come out with a Puerto Rican accent. Its foundational raison d'être is neoliberal capitalism, and its singular focus is to make profits. As such, we have shifted from an economy of sustenance to one of consumption, a worldview of service to one of power and privilege, a living out of a malformed, cheap spirituality, to borrow a phrase from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a disincarnate religiosity that bends its knees to the false idols of what Daniel G. Grudy calls money theism. Gustavo Gutierrez reminds us that these false gods of globalization are murderous gods who shed blood because of their desire for money. We live in a globalized world, a world, as Nelly Garcia Murillo states, where we have exchanged our well-being for well-having. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., we are more concerned with making a living than making a life. Profits, not people. And globalization is influenced and infected by the monetary policies of transnational corporations and international bodies such as the International Monetary Fund, who often determine national economic and social policies that thus far have been detrimental to the poor. Globalization has led to a spirit of globalized indifference, a state in which in the words of Matthew 24:12, the love of many has grown cold. We are infected with the me virus, a cold love that only cares for one's own being and for those who are like me. You have to sound like me and look like me, live like me, look like me. Globalization's complex interpenetration of social and economic policies has resulted in the unequal distribution of wealth. The gap between the rich and the poor has increased. This gap often follows gender and racial lines. The darker in complexion and the more one is identified as female, the poorer one tends to be in the world. This reality has led Howard Winan to assert that globalization is the re-racialization of the world. Thus, embedded in globalizing practices is an intricate philosophical web that devalues bodies of color. Collectively, such bodies constitute silenced societies, las sobrajas, the leftovers who are considered disposable. It is the thingification of the world. Everyone and everything is reduced to its potential profit-making end. This view is what allows us to commodify and exploit land, to fight wars over it, and to create arbitrary barriers around it, telling people that they are not welcome, though they are the victims of those who authored these globalizing economic and ecological policies. Jace Weaver astutely observes that environmental destruction is another expression of the same injustice that gives rise to racism and colonialism. Since the pandemic began, I have heard multiple times that people want to go back to normal. If we are to serve a God of life, we cannot go back to what we considered normal. We must understand that going back is to become mired in death rather than to be rooted in vida. We must hear the admonition of Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? It was expressed to a people who thought that religious ritual was sufficient, even as they practiced acts of injustice against the powerless. For too long, we have sacrificed lives and the planet to the altars of profit-making and unjust exploitation as we bow to the gods of the market. Today, we need people who heed the call of the God who is vida and love. Prophets, not prophets. We must denounce the patterns of living that are part of empire, of the realm of greed and indifference, of a society infected with the me virus of co-love. With eyes that often refuse to see, we must discern that runaway consumption is killing our planet and destroying the lives of the forgotten and the suffering sobrajas, no matter how much we want to rebaptize them and call them essential workers. We cannot continue in a death-dealing world of meism and co-love where we do not care that we spend billions on an unjust carceral system while we slash by 61% funding for housing, that we increase our defense budget by billions while cutting on resources for food for the poor by 40%, that we spend more on sports stadium than we do on the care for the planet, and that we have converted our health care from a human right into a billion-dollar profit-making industry of wellness apartheid. We must declare that the earth is the Lord's and not our plaything. To go back is to continue a path of death. To be called by the God who is Vida is to place our vision, our faith in the vision of God of life, who since the beginning created us to be in covenant with the one who is love and justice, and thus to believe that the ultimate eschatological word in history is life and is communal koinonia, that we are one with God, with each other, and the created world, created for life and for life abundant. But we're not just called by the God who is life, we're also called by the God who is Verbo, word. There's an interesting passage in 1 Samuel. Just piqued my curiosity. Because it says this: as Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. Well, such a strange passage, because in the Hebrew, as well as English and Spanish, and I'm very conscious that the Hebrew professor is there. So, but in the Hebrew, as well as the English and Spanish translation, there's this ambiguity to the text, because whose words are supposed to be kept from falling to the ground? Is it Yahweh's words, or is it Samuel's words? Well, I think that the ambiguity is intentional. Because, you see, Samuel was called during a time of war and political and religious corruption. Indeed, such was the level of corruption that the text notes that the word, or davar, of the Lord was rare, and that visions were scarce. Davar was often associated with God's spirit. God is verbo, verb, denoting God's activity in the world. God said, and it was so. So to not fling words means to be called to honor faithfully the words of prophecy given by God's ruach. Did I get that right? Ruach. I love that because it just sort of clears out all your adenoids. Words have an impact on reality because they are a gift from the God who is Word. Therefore, words are not to be used lightly. In 2 Testament, Jesus warns that if a person calls another a fool, it is as they commit murder. Now, if there's anybody here who has ever been insulted in a humiliating way with a slur, we understand existentially how deeply such words wound and their capacity to destroy something irreplaceable with it. It is a murder. Words have a creative power. It's an amazing thing that God, who is life and verbo, grants us the power of words. And in doing so, invites us to partner tikkun olam with God in a co-creative process. A French philosopher describes the world as an instrument of dialogue. I love that. An instrument of dialogue in which God addresses the world daily, and we are invited to respond, to generate with responsibility and freedom. Perhaps another way of understanding this dialogue is to say that all of creation is shaped and formed by this multilingual communications that take place among all of creation with the God who embraces us in mutual dialogue. How tragic then that instead of using this creative gift of mutuality for life-giving, we have chosen to use words to distort, destroy, obfuscate, and humiliate. We have destroyed the public square with demeaning words. We hurl epithets as if they were wordle games, with no purpose other than to claim victory in political and social joustings. We call people fools and idiots. We threaten HBCUs and silence teachers for teaching. We hold guns against those who defend the right to wear masks and threaten to shoot unless we remove a woman's right to choose. We denigrate whole communities because they do not look like us, walk like us, talk like us, believe like us, or because we are convinced that they, by their very existence, somehow taint us. We despise those we have deemed as illegal aliens. We have reduced them to thinghood, dehumanizing them, giving us permission to shoot them, gas them, and place them in concentration camps where they languish for no other crime than that they sought to escape the nightmares that our own colonial policies created in their countries of origin. We use words to ensure that beings created and loved by God become silenced objects that we can manipulate, destroy, or discard at whim. We are seeing today the fruit of the violence of our words. A society rent in pieces, parent against child, siblings at odds, neighbors pulling out shotguns on neighbors, people being murdered for the simple act of jogging along the street, racist slurs, anti-Asian hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, hate against the LGBTQIA plus community, slurs of hate that have consequences. Hate crimes are on the rise and people have been murdered. We have flung our words, the gift that God has given us by the God who is Verbo de Vida, and we have flung them to the ground. Another way of flinging words to the ground is by denying the power of truth. You know, truth is a powerful tool against despots. It is no coincidence that in the Johannine Passion narratives, when Jesus is brought before Pilate, Pilate asks, "What is truth?" The modern version of this questioning of the veracity of truth is the deluge of misinformation and the debate about fake news. Some decades ago, it was all truth is relative. Today, in an age of Christian nationalism, QAnon, and conspiracy theories, this has morphed into, that is not my truth. An unsurprising reductionism in a neoliberal capitalist consumerist society that believes that everything can become the property of an individual. However, truth isn't the sole property of one individual. Truth are, in the words of Umberto Eco, fragments, alas, how illegible, and thus obscure to us. Often we only see through a mirror dimly. What this means is while each of us may have a sliver of truth, which we interpret according to our social location, it is hubris when we try to claim that our particular illegible fracture is the whole truth. Truths transcend human pettiness and desires. They encompass not only me, but all of creation. Truth cannot be owned. Truths are transcendent because their foundation is God. For Christians, truths flow from God who is Verbo and Verdad, word and truth. As such, truth does not cause divisiveness. It does not build walls of distrust and separation. Truth does not lead to brokenness. Truths are not uttered intentionally to engender hate. In speaking truth to power, it does not disparage and humiliate. If God is indeed the source of truth, then truth brings light, peace, and justice. Truth is not selfish. It does not arise from fear, nor does it create fear. Truth brings life. It does not require an AK-47. It does not seek to willfully harm. Truth is a charism of the Spirit of God who is, and therefore Spirit is just, grace-filled, generous, and seeks the shalom of the oikonomia. Truth sets us free. We are surrounded by words flung to the ground, words that wound, that attack, that agitate, and deceive. Their source is not from el Dios, quien es verbo de vida. As people argue vociferously about fake news, no one pays attention to the non-news, the issues that affect the victimized, the oppressed of our country. For example, Mitzi Smith described how, with little fanfare, water, which should be a human right, was privatized, causing financial and social fiasco for communities of color who had to choose between water and rent. In the brouhaha of fake news, this ongoing tragedy went unreported. It was non-news. If we are to be the followers of the God who is Verbo de Vida, we must be a people who do not fling words to the ground. We must discern the multiplicative oppressions that surround us. To be a people called by the God who is Vida and Verdad, we must have the courage to practice moral agency and use our words for life, hope, and justice. We must be unafraid to expose the spaces of those silenced by the colonizing forces of empire. The unjust fear truth. They fear prophetic words that expose them and provide hope to the oppressed. Else, why such a severe backlash against critical race theory? Why the burning of books or the silencing of history when narrated from the perspective of the periphery? We must ensure that we are attuned to the silent cries of the marginalized and forgotten and lift our voices for justice and for life. Let our words rise and sass back, in Smith's terminology, in the face of violence and oppression. Let us utter words prophetically so that justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And finally, let me just say a few words about the God who is Presencia. One of the insidious effects of globalization is that while it acts as an economic and cultural tsunami that interpenetrates and devastates nations and their communities, its technological prowess has allowed those in power to claim that the world has shrunk. After all, we can travel halfway across the world in hours instead of months. Or we can see what is going around at any place in the world with the tap of a screen. But in reality, globalization has caused a curious disconnect from the very earth on whose thriving our lives and its inhabitants depends. We are often shielded from the social consequences of the things that benefit us in a globalized economy. It is difficult for us to envision that what we do in the spaces of the everyday has consequences for people and communities that we don't know and, frankly, we don't really care about. It is almost incomprehensible that we study on campuses whose lands were robbed for indigenous people, and even when we make statements of acknowledgement, there's really no intention to return those lands to them. I mean, really. We don't stop to consider that the clothes that we wear are sewn in sweatshops, that the TVs in our living rooms have left toxic waste in the land and poisoned people in maquiladores miles away? It is this disconnect that allows us, almost with an air of self-righteousness, to accuse migrants of being illegal. Let them do it lawfully, we say, having no idea the cost it entails or the years it takes, while our industries and our armies have entered their countries unimpeded, and our actions have upended their social fabric and economies, ecologies, and created political instability. It is we who have invaded them. Yet, it is we who bar their entry here and treat them like criminals. We are disconnected from the fact that the pandemic has allowed billionaires to double their wealth while the majority of the planet has become poorer. While poor nations have suffered from lack of proper health care, PPEs, and vaccines to combat the novel coronavirus, some choose to use their wealth to make shiny rockets for a day in the outer stratospheres of the atmosphere. Injustice, you see, is lived in the spaces of absence. God, however, is not absent. God is not disconnected. God is presence, presencia, and present, presente, especially among those who are forgotten in society. In the early years of her career, the late Ada Maria Isasi Diaz affirmed that structural changes made no difference to poor women, and particularly poor Latinas, if structures failed to change their lives at the level of lo cotidiano, the spaces of the everyday. We need to be attentive to the institutional justice and liberation and ensure that they make the differences in the spaces of the everyday of the lives of the poor. To do so, we must heed the call by the God who is presencia to be present in these peripheric spaces with those who live and die outside the gate of justice and hope. Such spaces are the places where people are most invisible, most absent from history. They are inhabited by the homeless, the transients, the underemployed and unemployed, the streetwalkers, the undocumented, the incarcerated, the ones that our modern society has deemed unclean or unfit or unholy, the ones we don't want in our churches because they smell up the benches. These are the oppressed, the poor, the voiceless, and the sobrajas of our world, those who have no one to go to and no place to be. They are the ones dying in our streets, the macheted, the machine-gunned, the bombed out in the world. They watch us with gaunt faces of hunger and scarred bodies. They reside in the outside gates, places of the world where God beckons us to be presente. They are also the poor from the Latinx, African American, and Native American communities most severely affected by the pandemic. The impact of the pandemic on such communities should not surprise us. They are the most affected by the healthcare inequities. Healthcare has been absent in those communities. Researchers such as Rohan Kazanchi and et al. Discovered that health inequities were primarily due to systemically racist policies such as historic racial segregation and their inextricable downstream effects on the differential quality and distribution of housing, transportation, economic opportunity, education, food, air quality, healthcare, and beyond. These communities are not only under or uninsured, but also reside in geographical spaces that are conducive to higher health risks. Soon et al. Found that geography mattered in the outbreak of the coronavirus 2019. In the segregated spaces of ghettos, reservations, overcrowding, and dilapidated housing, conditions abound that lead to many of the supposed primary comorbidities, such as heart disease, that heighten the risk for novel coronavirus. Such neighborhoods are rich in fast food restaurants and poor in nutritious foodstuffs. They are often the targets for disposal of toxic waste, resulting in high incidence of cancers and asthma. Housing density is higher, and urban forestry, trees and parks that absorb carbon dioxide is minimal. Decades of redlining practices and absentee slumlords have left such neighborhoods bereft of the tax infrastructure that promotes the health of communities, good schools, parks, safety, security, public services, etc. It is these peripheric places that God calls us to serve and to be presente with the God of Presencia, to bring hope and life. So many of us want to go and pastor in big churches with air conditioners, but that's not where God is calling us, you see. I'm sorry. Did I say something wrong? Okay, anyway. Globalization has disconnected us from such places and deafened us to the cries of the suffering. We must ensure that our intellectual and educational capacities do not become a shield that blind us to the absent ones. Some years ago, while I was in a conference, a group of scholars were talking, and a Bible scholar among them began to scoff at people who claim that God hears them and speaks to them. As he spoke, I thought of Daisy L. Machado's story about Elena, a Latin American refugee seeking asylum in the U.S. after a right-wing paramilitary squad killed her husband and all the men in her village. They repeatedly raped Elena with foreign objects, even though she was pregnant. And just before releasing her, they cut off her nose so that she could serve as a billboard and a warning to anyone who acted in a way believed to be subversive by the government. Of what use is a God with no ears and no eyes to a woman with no nose? Such a God of absence is a God of death. This is not a God of Vida, Verbo, y Presencia. Such a God cannot bring justice or comfort or hope to the Elenas of the world. Such a God is of no hope to the trafficked, the refugee, the mothers of black and brown children who are gunned down mercilessly, the trans women who are abused, the indigenous peoples whose sacred lands are confiscated and trampled upon, or the Asian Americans who are spit upon and arrested for no other crime than their appearance. God can only be the God of vida, love, justice, and truth only if God is the God of Presencia, who has eyes to see and ears to hear our cries, who stands especially with and among those who are dying daily outside the gates of justice. This is the God who calls us today. In light of recent events, a virus that continues to affect and infect our population, a sudden new war that has the potential for far greater destruction than we can imagine, an economic collapse that has long been in the making as we begin to face the consequences of a fallacy that resources are infinite and available for eternal consumption. People are overwhelmingly afraid and uncertain, and they are angry. So what do we say in such circumstances in a world gone global, a world infected with a me virus where love has grown cold, a world in which instability and uncertainty becomes a seedbed for collective selfishness, a source of hate and distrust, and at times a source of virulently violent reactions? Certainly, as Gail Marie Henderson observed, our churches are woefully unprepared to deal with such a far-ranging and profound crisis. Abdel Kabir Khatibi has challenged us to be a people of other thinking, that we may discern beyond the limitations of westernized versions of knowledge, that we can perceive those silenced by the elites and the powerful. I want to suggest that as a people called by the God who is, that we are called to be not so much people of other thinking as much as being a people of other being. Or to put it slightly different, that we are called to be a people of other isness. We are called to embody in the world and for the world what God wills for all since the beginning. A diverse and communal life lived in the fullness of God's Presencia and in communion with all of creation. To be a people of other isness is to understand that we are not called to be in these rarefied spaces to obtain prestige and privilege, to be lauded and celebrated, to have our egos stroked. We are people called to be given tools not to construct the master's house, but to provide new avenues of life, to construct new spaces where there is no space, to bring hope, to speak a timely word, to be presente and to be light, to have the courage to go to the peripheric spaces of the world. We are called to these spaces to embody the God who is life and justice in places of death, the God who is word by affirming hope in spaces of despair, and the God who is presencia by being present in times of crisis and loss. In those places of deep darkness, no one is going to ask you what your diploma is. No one is going to ask you what your GPA is. They're not going to turn to us for comfort and in grief because we got an A+ on our Hebrew exam. But they are going to turn to us for comfort and for healing in the face of grief and hopelessness and despair. The prophet Habakkuk faced some of these crises that we're facing today. As a prophet, as a person of other isness, his heart was torn as he witnessed war and the menace of annihilation from without and political and religious corruption from within. Those most affected were the poor, the landless, the widow, and the orphan. In short, those unable to fend for themselves. Habakkuk wonders where God is, and he even started wondering if God cared. So he got up on his tower and he started shaking his fist at God. What is wrong with you, God? What is wrong with you? I'm sure some of you have had those moments. What is wrong with you? And God hears the prophet's cries and responds, trust in the promise. Trust in the vision. Trust that I am el verbo y la verdad, presencia y presente. And then God said something very interesting. Now, in most of your Bibles, it says, the just shall live by faith. Right? Now, a lot of you know this. Those of you who studied Luther, you know this. But if you really look at the Hebrew, the wording in the Hebrew is very interesting. Because it says this, look at the audaciousness. Look at the audaciousness of the crooked-necked. But the just shall live through fidelity. The word for soul or napesh literally means throat or neck. The organ to breathe and to feed. The text imagery recalls birds in their nests who must outstretch their neck to feed. Crooked-necked people believe that they don't need God. They believe themselves to be gods who are fully self-sufficient and can rob others' livelihoods with impunity. See, if you're crooked-necked, you can't breathe right. So they not only can't breathe right, then they don't let other people breathe either. The audacity. That's what the text says. The audacity. In a globalized world where love has grown cold, to be unjust is akin to having a crooked neck. God's spirit of life cannot flow. They obstruct the God who is life and breath. To be an other isness people is to be just or straight-necked. It is to understand that our lives flow from the life of the one who is Vida. It is to live our call faithfully, no matter what breath-robbing virus, injustice, war, hate, prejudice, no matter what death. God who is life wills life. God who is spirit will faithfully breathe in us, through us. And we are called to be straight-necked, other isness people, so that God's life will flow through us and be life to others around us. To be other isness people is to be a faithful conduit of life in a suffering world. May it be so.
We will have time for questions, and Shatika will come around and give you the mic so that we can capture what folks are saying. Any questions? Or are we still digesting?
I think so.
I have a question. As you, oh, sorry. As you think through, no, as you were thinking through how and what you wanted to say to us tonight, did you have an image or a person or a something that was your companion as you were writing, thinking, feeling, doing?
Let me make sure I understand your question. Are you asking me, did I write this thinking of somebody in particular? Is that your question?
Someone or something or...
Honestly, I wasn't thinking of anyone particular. I prayed very, very much for this place and for today, knowing that there was going to be an audience here and an audience live stream that I'm not even looking at, can't see. Mm-hmm. They can see me. But just asking for a timely word in a world that is so filled with grief. Mm-hmm. But this was about, this was to honor Antoinette Brown. And it seems to me that here was a woman who had courage to speak. And she was being silenced, but she had the courage to speak. And in that way, she was very prophetic. And I think what I was trying to communicate is that we need courage to speak. We need prophets. And I hope that I've encouraged somebody here to be a prophet today, because everybody's sort of caught up in the grief of loss, and so many of us have lost, and we don't know what to do with our loss. And I understand that. And I hope that partly what I've done is encourage you and reminded you that in the midst of that loss, there is still life. That the ultimate word in history is not death, but is life, and we need to hang on to that. But second of all, that we have the amazing gift and honor and privilege to be called at this time to be prophetic. And in a world awash in grief and loss, that we do have a word of life to give to ourselves, but also to the world, and especially to the world. And when I say the world, I don't mean just people. I mean the planet itself. If we don't start fighting for life, if we just go with the flow of, oh my gosh, and in Spanish we say, ay bendito, right? If we, right? If we keep writing Puerto Rican Spanish, if we keep going, ay bendito, oh my gosh, if we keep doing that, we're just gonna keep sliding down. But we have the gift. Every time I think of the fact that we have the gift to communicate, that is a divine gift, that's an amazing thing. We have amazing things. We're given amazing tools. And then in addition to that, you are given the amazing tool to be in this place, to learn from amazing professors. So you're given tools on tools on tools. So how can you sit there and say, I don't know what to do? Or I don't have the energy to do? Right? You're being called to be prophets, and to be prophets of life. So go forth. Go forth. And that's what I was thinking. I was thinking of Antoinette Brown, who everybody kept saying no to, and she was stubborn and persevered, right? And so many of us are here because we were said no to, but we were stubborn and we persevered, and here we are. So let's be stubborn. Let's look at death and say, heck no, and be stubborn and persevere, and let's bring life.
Thank you. Yes, Emily.
First of all, I'm so happy to see Loida in person. I haven't seen her in person in a couple of years. Unsurprisingly, the God who is looks Trinitarian. And I've heard you preach and teach a lot about the inherent relationality in God's self. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the relationality of the immanent Trinity around those three pieces that you just laid out. Because as you were talking, I was thinking, of course we have to do this, because interrelationality, immanent Trinity, and the immanent Trinity is the interrelationality in the economic Trinity. So I just wondered if you could put those pieces together.
I wasn't sure how ecumenical the audience was going to be, so I try not to bring in too much Trinitarian
Didn't
language.
need to blow your cover on Trinity there.
And I certainly didn't want to glaze anybody's eyes over. But yes, I very much believe that God is Trinitarian. But even if you didn't believe that God was Trinitarian, I think that the God who has created this world has time and time again shown the love that God has for this world, right? In ways large and small. And I think that relationality and love is evident also in the Jewish tradition, and they're not Trinitarian. So I think that for those of us who are Trinitarian, the Trinitarian theology gives us language to talk about that relationality, but you don't need that language to talk about that relationality. Within Trinitarian language, I use a lot the language perichoresis, and my students laugh, especially when I use that in a wedding vow thing one time, and everybody cracked up. But perichoresis is it's really a beautiful word, because it talks about how intimately that the three persons of God are so intimately conjoined with each other that they are one, right? I think that in this world, if we don't start learning to realize how intimately conjoined our survival is on each other, that it's not a choice, right? That absolutely every single species on this planet is absolutely needed for the survival of every other species on this planet. If we don't begin to think about it in that way, if we keep thinking that some things are extraneous that we can do without, we're going to keep getting in trouble. Recently I started reading Thich Nhat Hanh's Peace is a Step, and I love how he talks about interbeing. So everything is an interbeing. So for him, for his Buddhist language, it's interbeing. For my Christian Trinitarian language, it's perichoresis. But I think it's always that language of conjoinment, you know? And you know, in Spanish, we talk about teología en conjunto. And literally, it's theology done conjointly, right? They translate that as collaborative theology, but literally the word means conjoined. That we cannot do theology as singular people, that it has to be very dialogical. And I love that because it reminds me of how much we depend on each other. So if we keep, and you know, even when we talk about racial issues, we keep doing this still in silos, right? So the African American community over here, and the Asian American community over here, and the Latinx community over there, and we have to stop siloing. That's number one. And we need to start realizing that the survival of one depends on the well-being. See, it's not that the survival of one depends on the survival of the other, that the survival of one depends on the well-being and thriving of the other. So we have to start looking at the well-being and thriving of each other. And until we don't start learning to do that, we're going to keep getting in trouble, right? And it's this me virus that's going around. See, everybody's worried about the coronavirus. I'm worried about the me virus. Everything is a me thing. And we need to stop thinking in terms of me, and we need to start thinking in terms of we and us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I knew it.
I was debating. I wasn't going to go there. But first of all, thank you so much for your fabulous lecture. I learned a lot. And I think, you know, your diagnosis is entirely correct in many ways and at many levels. So globalization is both real obstructionist as well as opportunity provider. But it seems as if the opportunities that were afforded by these efforts of globalization has been really mucked about by a lot of multinational corporations, other entities. So what would you say, you know, I love the last bit you said about our survival really depends on each other's thriving. How do we really do that? I mean, I think, you know, just what you've laid out is just so beautiful. And I was just like wanting a little more like, okay, just great description of the problem. So how do we overcome that isness or me, myself, and I kind of problem, meism? So what would you provide, whether it's from Buddhist tradition as you just laid out, or Christian or Jewish or other religious traditions or combinations thereof? What are some concrete steps that we can actually just take to heart? And as I'm involved in the task of teaching and learning with students here as well. Thank you.
This almost feels like, you know, when you pray for world peace, because it is so complex, right? There are so many things that have to be done. I think, at least in the U.S., we have to overcome this, and it's so ingrained. The celebration of the individual as a culture, the individual, you know, this whole Protestant ethic, that individualism and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So you're practically having to redo a culture. And this is where I believe very much in alliances. And we've done this, and I look at your dean when I say we've done this, because I met your dean when we were precisely groups of us getting together across groups and creating alliances and having conversations and being enriched by each other and learning what each other's communities were doing for the thriving. And so not only learning, I was not just only learning what was happening in the African American community for their thriving, but then also learning how could I support that thriving. And they were learning what were my struggles and what were the things that I was doing for thriving. And so they were also learning how to be an ally to myself, right, and to my community. And I don't know what happened, that somewhere along the line that stopped. Those conversations stopped. And I think we need to start having those conversations again. And that's what I mean by the siloing. We have to stop the siloing. I know that there are specific things that happen at the macro level of scholarship that stopped those, that sort of put an end to those, and we went back to the silos. So I know what some of those things are. But at the micro level, sometimes it's hard to start up those silos, those cross currents again. But I think we need to start those. So that's one piece. Being intentional. I remember always reading a book by Bell Hooks, and she was talking about how she lived as a scholar because of the school she was at. She was living in a white community. She goes, "Listen, I'm an African American person living in a white community, and it's hard for me to meet up with my African American friends who live in an African American community." So she talked about how difficult it is when you are in one place to cross the border, right? There has to be an intentionality about that, because there's I hate to quote Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas used to say likes like. We sort of fall into a habitus of where we are. And so we don't want to expend the energy to cross over and get to meet the other. And so there's an intentionality. And even though that's at a micro level, all the energy that takes and intentionality is a very prophetic thing to do. So I think at a micro level, that's the first thing I would say. That doesn't change structures, but at a micro level, that's still a very powerful thing, right? Because there's something to be said about grassroots movements and the energy that does. Okay. At an institutional level, there are things that can start happening, but those are institutions. So in education, the whole way we even look at education has to be redone. And right now, education, if you just look at theological education, theological education has been formed from its beginning by a majority white people. It's still in the hands of white people. So you can have a smattering of people of color as deans and presidents, but the bulk of people who are making the decisions and moving the monies are white people. So how do you change the ethos and values of education in theological education? But we have to do that, right? We have to start teaching. We have to teach people differently. If you keep teaching people for grades, so what are you calling excellence? That they graduated with a 4.0? Is that what excellence is? Or there's an indigenous notion of education that means journey to become. Can theological education become a process where you're on a journey to become, rather than you're becoming a scholar of 4.0? Okay. So we've been doing this now for 200 years. Has it gotten us anywhere? But, I say that, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of scholars fainting and going, having heart attacks, right? Because it's our livelihood. And I'm not saying that you have to do that, but I'm saying that we have to have a conversation about what theological education is and what is it that we want to do with it. And we haven't had that conversation. It's just, it has its own energy and it just keeps going. And nobody stopped this machinery and said, is this really what we want to do with it? Right? And everything is organized around that. Tenure and hiring, and right? So how do we change that? And that's at a macro level. So health is the same thing. Why isn't health care it's a human right? We know it's a human right. So why does it create such angst? And why is it suddenly being called socialism and communism? It's a human right. And this pandemic showed how utterly bankrupt our healthcare system is. Have we learned anything from it? No. And 10, 20 people became billionaires out of this pandemic, off of the back of 6 million people who died. Think about that. Something is terribly wrong with healthcare. So you see, so there's the institutional things that we have to change. I'm hoping I'm answering your question. There are the practical institutional things that we have to change, but there's also the micro things. And one thing doesn't necessarily change the other, right? But rather they're faces of a same coin, and you have to be attentive to both and that takes a lot of energy and a lot of works, and this is why we need prophets. Not prophets ITS, but PHETS, right? We need prophets, and prophets are usually the people who bug everybody else until something gets done. And I'm hoping that we get here a room full of prophets.
I want to thank you. You gave us a full evening and much to think about and a lot to take with us. I can't think of a better way to leave a lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I invite you to join us in the atrium for a bit of cookies and many other things right outside. Thanks again for coming.